The clinic door opened that morning the same way it had opened 1,000 times before, and yet nothing about what came next would ever feel ordinary again. Something stepped through that doorway that had no reason to be there, no instinct that should have brought it to a place like this, and yet there it was, as still and deliberate as if it had made this choice long before anyone inside had time to think. What happened in the next few minutes would leave every person in that room quietly questioning everything they thought they knew about wildness and what it sometimes asks of us. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable weather, the kind of morning that moves slowly in a small veterinary clinic, a cat carrier on the bench, the low hum of the front desk fan, the faint smell of antiseptic and pine-based cleaner. Dr. Alan Morrow had just stepped out of the back room with a folder in his hand when his receptionist, Karen, went completely still. She didn't speak, she didn't point, she simply stopped, the way people stop when language becomes suddenly useless. He followed her eyes to the door. A bobcat stood in the entrance, not outside, peering in, inside, past the threshold, standing on the tile floor of a working veterinary clinic in rural North Carolina, in the middle of a Tuesday morning, as though it had an appointment. Nobody moved. The animal was mid-sized, probably a young adult male, though in that moment no one was thinking in clinical terms. What everyone registered first, before species or size or danger, was the way it held itself. There was no aggression in its posture. No arched spine, no flattened ears, no wide defensive eyes scanning the room for an exit. It stood with a kind of tired, deliberate weight, and its front left paw, barely grazing the floor, told the rest of the story. It was hurt, badly enough that it had stopped hiding. That detail, more than anything, is what broke through the instinct to retreat. Wild animals don't come toward people when they're injured. Every survival mechanism they have tells them to do the opposite, to disappear, to go still, to wait it out alone in the dark. What this animal was doing ran against everything written into its biology, and somehow that made it harder to be afraid of it than it should have been. Dr. Morrow set the folder down on the counter, slowly, without looking away. He'd been a vet for 19 years. He'd worked with domestic animals his entire career, dogs, cats, the occasional rabbit or bird. He had no wildlife training, no specialized equipment for a situation like this, and every rational part of his professional mind was already composing the sentence he should have said out loud. We need to call a control. We need to clear the room. This is not our call to make. He didn't say any of it. Instead, he crouched, not toward the animal, just down, lowering himself to its level, reducing his silhouette, becoming smaller and less threatening in the only language that might mean something here. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He kept his eyes soft, not locked in the hard stare that predators use. He breathed through his nose, slowly. The bobcat watched him. 10 seconds passed, maybe 15. Karen hadn't moved from the desk. The other tech, a young woman named Daria, had backed herself against the far wall, not running, just still, holding her breath the way you hold it when something fragile is balancing on an edge. Then the bobcat took a step forward, one step, deliberate. The injured paw touched down for just a moment before the animal shifted its weight back to the others. Even in that small motion, the pain was visible, not dramatic, not theatrical, just the quiet, honest way an animal moves when it has been hurting for a while and has learned to manage it. There was something almost patient about it, something that felt less like desperation and more like a decision that had already been made. It stopped, 3 feet from where Dr. Morrow was crouched, and it looked at him. Not the frantic, cornered look of a wild animal caught somewhere it doesn't belong, not the blank, disconnected gaze of an animal in shock. It looked at him the way, and he would struggle to explain this for a long time afterward, the way you look at someone when you've run out of other options and you've decided, against all the evidence and all your instincts, to try trusting them anyway. He didn't reach for it. He didn't speak. He just stayed exactly where he was and let the animal hold that moment for as long as it needed to. Later, when people asked him what he was thinking right then, he told them the truth. He wasn't thinking much at all. He was just present, just there. In a quiet room on a Tuesday morning, crouched on a tile floor, with a wild bobcat standing 3 feet in front of him, and something passing between them that he didn't have a word for yet. He wasn't sure he ever would. He made the first move, not toward the animal, just sideways. A slow, unhurried shift in weight, turning his body at a slight angle, making himself even less of a wall, less of a confrontation. It was the kind of movement you make when you want something to know that you are not hunting it. The bobcat's ears adjusted, tracking him, but it didn't step back. Dr. Morrow began talking, low, even, almost monotone, not words meant to comfort in any human sense, but sound, steady, predictable sound, the kind that says, I am still here, I am still the same, nothing has changed. He'd done it with frightened dogs his whole career. He'd never imagined doing it with this. He asked Daria, without raising his voice, to bring the trauma kit. Just that, nothing else. She moved carefully along the wall and disappeared into the back. The bobcat tracked the motion, head turning, muscles tightening for just a moment, and then settled again. Its breathing was visible now that Morrow was watching for it, slightly labored. The injured leg trembled faintly when it bore any weight at all. Whatever had happened, a car, a trap, a fall, it had happened long enough ago that the body was already deep in the work of managing it. Daria returned and set the kit on the floor 3 feet to Morrow's left without a word. She understood, the way good assistants understand, that this was not a moment for protocol. This was something else entirely. Morrow opened the kit without looking down at it. His eyes stayed on the bobcat. He extended one hand, not reaching, not grabbing, just offering the back of his knuckles toward the ground. The universal gesture of, here I am, decide for yourself. He'd seen it work with strays too damaged to believe in kindness anymore. He didn't know if it would translate to something wild. He offered it anyway. The bobcat lowered its head, 1 slow inch at a time, ears back slightly, eyes never fully closing. It brought its nose to within a breath of his hand. It didn't make contact. It just held there, reading him in the way animals read things, not with logic, not with language, but with something older and more honest than either. Then it exhaled, a long quiet breath, and with it some invisible thing released. The tension in its shoulders dropped by degrees. It didn't curl up, didn't surrender, but it stayed, and in the language of a wild animal, staying is everything. Morrow reached slowly for the kit. The examination had begun. The wound was worse than it looked from a distance. Morrow worked slowly, peeling back matted fur around the left foreleg with the kind of careful, unhurried hands that take years to develop. What he found underneath was a deep laceration, infected, swollen at the edges, the skin pulled tight in the way tissue pulls when it has been fighting something for too long without help. A wire snare, most likely, the kind set illegally in the woods and forgotten. The kind that doesn't care what it catches. The bobcat flinched when he touched it, a full body shudder, quick and sharp, and for 1 suspended second the room held its breath, but it didn't pull away. It turned its head and looked at him, that same steady, exhausted look. And then it faced forward again, and let him continue. Morrow felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't try to name. He'd treated thousands of animals in pain. He knew how to stay clinical, how to keep the necessary distance that let him do the job well. But there was something about the deliberateness of this animal's stillness, the conscious, effortful choice it kept making to stay, to endure, to trust, that was quietly dismantling something in him. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic. The bobcat's claws extended once against the tile, a reflex, involuntary, then slowly retracted. It breathed. He breathed. Daria stood at the edge of the room with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, and she didn't say a word, and that was exactly right. The infection had gone deep enough that oral antibiotics alone wouldn't be enough. Morrow would need to debride the tissue, a painful process under any circumstances, nearly unthinkable without sedation on a wild animal. He sat back on his heels and looked at the bobcat for a long moment, thinking through the math of it. Sedation meant a dart or an injection. Injection meant closing that 3-foot distance completely. He reached for the syringe, prepared it, held it low and out of the animal's sight line. Then he waited, not for permission. Animals don't give permission. He waited for stillness, for the particular quality of quiet that had settled over the room like something intentional. And when it came, when the bobcat exhaled again and let its weight shift fully onto its 3 good legs, Morrow moved, smooth, certain and gentle, and it was done before the animal had time to decide anything about it. The bobcat sank slowly to the floor, and in the silence of that small clinic, something that had been wild and alone and in pain for a very long time, finally rested. It took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of a makeshift recovery kennel in the back corner of the clinic, constructed from what they had and reinforced with what they borrowed. 3 weeks of twice daily wound checks, antibiotics hidden in raw meat, and the particular kind of patience that can't be taught in any program or learned from any book. It either lives in a person or it doesn't. In Morrow it lived deep. The bobcat didn't become tame. That was never the point. and he never made the mistake of wanting it to be. There were days it pressed itself into the far corner and watched him with flat, cautious eyes, days when the wildness reasserted itself fully, when it was clearly an animal in a box and not a patient in a clinic, and the distinction mattered. He respected those days. He moved slower on them, spoke less, left the food and stepped back and let it remember what it was. But there were other days too, days when he'd come in early, before the clinic opened, and find it sitting upright near the kennel door with an alertness that felt less like anxiety and more like anticipation. Days when it would eat while he was still in the room, a quiet, enormous act of trust from something built entirely around the instinct to be unseen. Once, near the end of the second week, it pressed the top of its broad head briefly against the kennel door, while his hand rested on the other side of it. He didn't move for a long time after that. The release happened on a Thursday morning, just past sunrise. He drove it out to a stretch of state forest land 15 miles from town, far enough from roads, close enough to water. He'd consulted with a wildlife rehabilitator by then, done everything correctly, documented everything properly. The paperwork existed, the process had been followed. None of that was what he remembered afterward. What he remembered was opening the kennel door and stepping back, and the Bobcat walking out into the tall grass with the same deliberate, unhurried weight it had carried into his clinic 3 weeks before. The limp was nearly gone. The coat had filled back in around the leg. It moved like something that had been restored to itself, not fixed exactly, but returned. It stopped once at the tree line, looked back, not long, just a moment, the way you look at something you are leaving and do not intend to forget. Then the grass closed behind it and it was gone, back into the world that had always been its own. Morrow stood there in the early morning quiet for a long time. He wasn't sure what had been given to him that Tuesday. But he knew, standing there in the still air with the tree line empty and the day just beginning, that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful for it.